All right. Well, good morning and happy Mother's Day. Isn't it wonderful? My son he said, do you want breakfast in bed? I'm like, really, I don't eat breakfast, but yogurt berry crunch. He made it and it was wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. So I hope you guys enjoyed Mothers. You enjoyed something as well. So as Thomas mentioned earlier, we have been looking at ourselves as a church family, and last week Kyla looked at place. Who are we in this place as a church family? And in Lincoln Road in Henderson, and so we're looking at that. But this week we're looking at what it means to be a church family on mission. Because I think we'd all agree we do have a little bit more purpose than to come here and sing nice songs and, take communion every week. That's great. But I think we all realise God has a bit more for us here than that. So I want us to start by thinking about one way in which you have changed in your life. So it doesn't need to be a spiritual way that you've changed, but something that you remember as a child or a kid that you were like, or even as an adult, maybe you were afraid of the dark or afraid of dogs or something like that, and you have changed in some way. You've overcome that fear, or you have altered, someone's changed you, maybe influenced you. So have a little think about that. I want you to turn to the person beside you and talk about that. If no one's sitting beside you, then now would be a good time to maybe move and find someone, because you might have to do this again through the service. Yeah, have a wee kōrero. Okay, tell them about this change. Do you know It's always hard getting interaction, bringing you all back. So we're going to do that a few more times today. But you can carry on those conversations later, and find out a bit more. So when I was a kid, I was actually pretty messy and pretty lazy. And it would be fair to say that I thought the bedroom floor was the wardrobe. And so navigating to the bed was always a bit of a challenge. But my mother once offered 2 cents to anyone in the family who would make their bed each day. And I thought that was actually pretty easy money. For about 3 days, I made my bed for 2 cents for, it seemed a no-brainer. It didn't continue. Someone must have said, had some parenting idea or something for her, and so she introduced this, but it didn't last. So I was, not a very tidy person and not a very disciplined or industrious person as a young person. And and I especially didn't make my bed. And this went on until we actually sold our first house. And I might have told some of you about this before, but when you sell your house, there's open homes and there are people that come into your home, and the agent wants to bring people in at any moment of the day. And so you have to make your bed every day, and the house has to look spick and span all the time. So that was the start of me actually learning to make my bed. And of course, Stephen, as you heard, did not grow up either lazy or messy in his house. And so gradual transformation through, living together, there was definitely some influence. He was very happy to live in a house that was not. The wardrobe was on the floor and things. So now, if you come to our house, you will see mostly that the bed is made and clothes are not scattered all over the floor. And so I can say that, yes, evidentially I have changed. But inside, I actually still feel sometimes like pretty messy and pretty lazy. I would like to go and read a book at the beach every day. That would be my life. I think that would be bliss. Why? I mean, just circumstances, I don't do that. But I still feel like I would like to do that and maybe leave my clothes all over the floor as well. But when we look at people, we actually have no idea what is going on inside them. We just judge. If you came to my house, you'd judge that I'm a reasonably tidy person. But I don't feel like that really inside. And so we've got to be careful about what we judge, how we evaluate people from the outside. And Paul talks about that in verse 16 of the chapter that we just read. He says, "So we have stopped evaluating others from a human point of view. At one time we thought of Christ merely from a human point of view. How differently we know him now." Now, I don't think that Paul was actually talking about housework here, but he is referencing that humanity of Jesus. He is talking about the walking, talking Jesus, who the disciples sat, they ate with, they nattered about stuff, they probably laughed uproariously, drank some wine together. They were in no doubt about Jesus' humanity. They could see it, they could touch it, they could feel it, his humanity. But then Jesus died and there was the resurrection, and that made them see Jesus completely differently. How differently we know him now. Now they understood that Jesus is not just human, he is God, and they know how transformative that has been for them. So Paul here is using the plural. He's saying, we understand this fledgling community of faith. They understood that Jesus, being God, had completely changed the way they saw the world. It had transformed them and changed them from one thing that they were, this sort of legalistic Jewish community, and it had changed them into another thing entirely. And we, the community of faith in Jesus, 2,000 years later, we also have been transformed. We have also been changed by Jesus. We understand that life, when we belong to Jesus, is simply never the same. And this is what he says in verse 17. This means that anyone who belongs to Christ has become a new person. The old life is gone. A new life has begun. And he talked about that earlier in the chapter. In verse 14 and 15, he said, because Christ died for us, we have also died to our old life. And because of this, we're controlled by the love of Christ. We no longer live for ourselves. And in fact, the beginning of this chapter, which many of you may have been reading and meditating on this week as we've been grieving friends and loved ones who have died recently, it gives us an exciting picture of the ultimate result of this new life in heaven with God. But this new life begins in our earthly bodies. Our transformation, our relationship with Jesus starts here on earth. And if you've spent any time with Jesus, if you've got to know him at all, you will have experienced that transforming power in your life. So what I'd like to do now is to talk to the person beside you and talk a little bit about one way in which Jesus has changed your life. And if you can't think of something, if Jesus hasn't changed your life in some way, maybe talk about what you would like him to change. Is there something that you would like him to change in your life together? So turn to the person beside you and talk about that one now. Alrighty, we could probably talk about that one for quite a long time. Yeah. But what we need to understand about transformation is that this is the work of God in our life. So we're not actually talking about me forming a better habit and learning to make my bed a bit more regularly, or being a bit tidier, modifying my behaviour in some way. This is something way more extraordinary, that God changes us from the inside. And it's God's work, it's not our work. So when we look at verse 18, 19, we see all of this is a gift from God, who brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us this task of reconciling people to him. For God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. And he gave us this wonderful message of reconciliation. This new life is a gift from God, new transformative life that comes not because of our efforts, not because of anything that we have done, but entirely from the grace of God. Now, there are books and books written on these verses, but it is an incredible and unending concept that when we start with the basics of reconciliation, it came from God. So let's look at that. Now, if we go to the dictionary, we find the meaning of reconciliation: the act of causing two people or groups to become friendly again after an argument or a disagreement, perhaps in our marriages, reconciliation, or the restoration of fractured relationships by overcoming grief and pain and anger, or the act of coming to an understanding and putting an end to hostility, as when former enemies agree to an amicable truce. And of course, because my husband is an accountant, I had to put in the accounting definition of reconciliation. Reconciliation is an accounting procedure that compares two sets of records to check that these figures are correct and in agreement. And it turns out that one of those records is a bank statement usually. And so that's what a bank reconciliation is. I might have been today years old when I learnt that, like just this week. Someone in our house does all the accounts and it's not me. But anyway, that's reconciliation, right? Making sure two things add up, but bringing 2 points together. Going back to that definition, an amicable truce. It doesn't really sound to me like real reconciliation. An amicable truce, a sort of friendly agreement not to destroy each other anymore. I mean, I think a better one is the fractured relationships being restored. Because if we look at Romans 5, verse 10, it says, "For while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life?" That we are reconciled when we were God's enemies. Our friendship with God was restored, says the NIV, when we were enemies of God. And here is where we understand just what a gift this was. See, when we were enemies, we were God's enemies. God was not our enemy. This was all on us. We thought that God was the enemy, but God did not look at it that way. That's not, we look at those definitions, two parties being hostile to each other. Well, that wasn't the case. We were hostile to God, but he wasn't hostile to us. It was fractured, but not because God fractured it, right? So our relationship was fractured because we fractured it. We were against God and we considered God the enemy. And many people feel that way about God right now. They think God is this big judgmental baddie telling them what to do, and they want nothing to do with him because they're in rebellion. God is their enemy. But Jesus came into that voluntarily to reconcile us, to bring us together with God, no longer counting people's sins against them. This is all about his work, not ours. See, the work of reconciliation begins before the work of justice. God made the first move in love for us. Grace or love is the only thing actually that can bring true reconciliation. See, grace affirms justice in the act of transcending it. We can't have reconciliation without paying attention to injustice in the relationship and addressing it, because otherwise it's just a false reconciliation. But Christ paid attention to our need to be justified. He took care of that in his death on the cross. But love came first, and love must always come first before things can be reconciled fully. There must be a genuine desire and commitment to working things out. Otherwise, the justice becomes a weighing machine of who did what, who said what, who is better, who's more hurt, who's more offended. And without love, there can never be an actual, true reconciliation of relationship. And the remarkable thing about Christ's work of reconciliation is that it's much bigger than perhaps we realise. We tend to think of this as a personal thing, that God, between us and God, that God came down, personal salvation, and it's vertical. God came down to us, we go back to God. But actually there's way more in this verse. God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. There is a horizontal element to this. If God is wanting to reconcile the world, that is quite a lot bigger than you and me. So how does that happen? Because when we look at the fractured and broken world, hostile world around us, we think of reconciliation as being at peace and restored relationships, but the world looks anything but that. Anything but peaceful. Even countries that are not at war, people are divided and angry and upset and killing each other in shootings on Ponsonby Road, as we've seen this week. And so when we look at these issues and problems in the world, issues of injustice or equity or creation care, all of these issues, we can start to bring about some more equity or justice. We are choosing to act as God's agents in the world to attempt to bring his care and reconciliation to the world around us. This is where God's work of reconciliation works horizontally as well as vertically. And this can happen on a macro level, like when we think of things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. We see an attempt to bring forgiveness and justice into what had been an extraordinary system of abuse and oppression. Or we can see it working when Christians attempt to work towards equity and justice in organisations and workplaces. Or when we work against division and racism in our society. So here's a quote from Shane Claiborne, who is one of these activists in the community. "The work of community, love, reconciliation, restoration is the work we cannot leave up to politicians. This is the work we are called to do." And it can work on a micro level when we walk and talk and interact with our friends and relatives and workmates to bring them towards a restored relationship with others and with God. And this is where we come in. In verse 20, he says, "So we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, 'Come back to God.'" That's what we say to our friends and relatives. God has given us this task of reconciling people to him. We all have friends and people who don't know God. You know someone who isn't talking to someone in their family, or isn't speaking, or doesn't have a good relationship in their workplace or their family. You know someone who's struggling in their marriage or in their relationships. And we know that God desires to be reconciled with everyone, including that person. And we have been given this task to tell them this is our mission, to encourage them to reconcile with God. You know yourself, if you think about what you shared earlier, you know what God has done in your life. God has changed you in some way, even if it's really indirect. He has had an effect in your life. And you know that his life has brought you life, and it's transformed you in a deep and significant way, not just on the surface, but you know people that would benefit from knowing God in that way. You know people with fractured relationships, people who think that God is the enemy, and they have no idea that God came to reconcile them to himself. So I would like us to take another minute now and to think of a person or persons that you know, someone who you see or spend time with regularly. It might be your neighbours, your workmates, it might be clients or family, it might be a club that you go to of some sort, someone you have a relationship with. And if you're sitting there and you're thinking, I can't think of anyone, because I know many of you work in Christian organisations like me. Well, I want you to think of what you could do, or what you could join, perhaps. A club. I joined the gym last week. Oh my word, you can do it too. So think of something that you could do, or someone that you're thinking of, that you have a relationship with, and turn to the person beside you and talk about that person or those people, and what your idea that you could invite them perhaps to something, have a coffee with them, go on a walk with them, invite them somewhere. And then I want us to pray together with the person beside you and pray for that person or people who you're talking about. And we will finish with this, because when we try to deal with the issues in the world, we look to Christ as our model of sacrificial love that we are called to emulate. I've been reading some Wolf this week, and I love Miroslav Wolf and his work. And so I'm going to end with a couple of quotes that he has talked about from his work, Exclusion and Embrace. He's done a lot of work in this area of reconciliation. So the significance of the crucifixion is not only what God does for us consistently throughout the New Testament. The crucifixion is portrayed as the pattern that we are to follow. It is a model of social behaviour toward the other, as well as a statement about what God has done for us. And this is who we want to be. This is who we want to be to our friends and family and people who we are interacting with. And the last one, if evangelism isn't an expression of love of neighbour, it isn't Christian evangelizing. And love of neighbour includes not only what I say to the neighbour, but how I say that. So turn to the person beside you and think about the people, the person that you're thinking of, and pray for them, pray with them, with the person, pray for those people together. You know what I mean. Yeah.